Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John Montgomery, and today we have an exciting game between Alireza Firouzja and Levon Aronian. And in this game, Alireza uses one of his favorite openings, the London system. This is a very compelling matchup between two of the best players in the world, Firouzja versus Aronian. Firouzja has the white pieces, Aronian has the black pieces. Let's begin. Firouzja begins with d4, Aronian knight f6, knight f3, d5, and bishop to f4. Firouzja plays many different forms of the London, including the Jobava London with the early knight c3. Here he plays a main line of the London system. Aronian responds directly attacking the center with c5, Firouzja e3, queen to b6, a great move that attacks b2 and puts more pressure on d4. Now Firouzja replies with knight to c3, seemingly leaving the b2 pawn hanging, but that pawn is not hanging. If Aronian were to decide to take it, queen takes b2, then the move knight to b5 is very powerful, threatening knight to c7 check, forking the king and the rook. Aronian would be forced to play knight to a6 just to stop the threat of knight to c7 check, and then the queen at b2 has very few available squares. After a move like a3, controlling b4, the queen has almost no breathing room at all. And after a move like, say, bishop to f5, attacking c2 twice with the bishop and queen, one of the many variations could be pawn takes, taking twice on c2, then rook to c1. When the bishop moves back to f5, knight b to d4, hits the rook, the bishop, excuse me, bishop goes to d7, then c6, interfering with the coordination. And obviously, if the pawn takes, you would just take the knight at a6, and if bishop to c8, then just bishop to b5, threatening discoveries, pawn up, check, block, bishop c6, rook can't go anywhere, and Firouzja would be winning. So the pawn at b2 is poisoned because of knight to b5. So Aronian plays bishop to d7 to control the b5 square. Now the b2 pawn is in jeopardy, so Firouzja defends it with rook to b1. e6, bishop to e2, knight c6 castles. Aronian takes in the center. He knows with that knight at c3 blocking that c2 pawn, that the half-open c-file is a very effective place for him to develop pressure. So he opens the half-open c-file, places his rook on it. a3, that stops anything like bishop to b4, coming in and taking this knight, ruining the pawn structure that is already on a half-open file. The bishop goes to e7, rook to e1, taking advantage of white's half-open e-file. Castling, and now all the pieces are fairly well developed, at least the minor pieces. And now Firouzja develops his plan of attack. He begins by moving the bishop at e2 to d3, aiming directly at the h7 square on the king side. Aronian plays a6, keeps material out of b5. Maybe he can expand with the pawn to b5 later. Firouzja jumps in, knight to e5, putting direct pressure on the bishop at d7, threatening to grab the two bishops, but the knight's very well placed. The pawn at d4 looks undefended. The problem is, if it's captured, then bishop to e3 pins the knight, and it's really nothing black can do about that pin. And if bishop to e8 takes, then bishop h7 check. This classic discovery with bishop h7 revealing an undefended queen on d4. I would play queen takes queen, and that would be it. So rook f to d8, centralizing the rook, adding to the defense of the bishop. Bishop g5. Now, so he takes the bishop at f4, moves it one square to g5, but there's a really nasty threat hidden behind this bishop to g5 move. If Aronian were to try to continue his play on the queen side, maybe put a knight on c4 with knight a5, then this is what would happen. Bishop takes bishop, bishop takes bishop, bishop h7 check. And if Aronian recaptures that bishop, queen to h5 check, king g8, queen takes f7 check, king h7, and simply rook to e3 with the threat of rook to h3, which would simply be the end of the game. So this move, bishop g5, just moving the bishop one square from f4 to g5, has a lot of danger and venom behind it. Aronian moves the king to f8, away from that check. Firouzja goes ahead and takes the knight, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, queen to h5, which does threaten mate on f7, which Aronian easily defends with bishop to e8. Now knight to g4, hits the bishop at f6, could cripple black's kingside pawn structure. Aronian goes ahead and grabs that pawn at d4. Notice that the pawn on f2 is defended by the knight at g4 at the moment, so he can't just grab that. Firouzja takes the pawn at h7. King goes to e7. The best defense, as it turns out, was g6, allowing the bishop to tuck back at g7, and it would be hard for Firouzja to get at the king, or harder for the Firouzja to get at the king after that move. But Aronian plays king to e7, putting his king in the middle of the board. Firouzja plays knight to e2, hitting the bishop at d4. And now king to d6. This is not the best move. Bishop to d7 was a little bit better. Of course, he's threatening rook to h8, which would trap the queen at the moment. And Firouzja could play queen h4, get his queen out of the way, and would still be better because Aronian's king is in the middle of the board. But this was the best approach for Aronian. But instead he plays king to d6, now c3. Now what's he going to do with his dark squared bishop? It moves it to e5, but now Firouzja plays bishop to c2. He wants to reroute that bishop to a4, take the knight at c6, and remove the defender of the e5 bishop. Only the king would defend it in that case. So Aronian goes ahead and defends it with f6, but now after queen g7, Aronian is in huge trouble because Firouzja controls that 7th rank and the king can't move back, which means Aronian's king is really stuck in the middle of the board and Firouzja gets to go right after it. Bishop to h5, knight takes f6, rook to c7, hitting the queen. Now, really nice tactic here from Firouzja. He does not move his queen, but instead plays knight to e4 check, and the king has nowhere to go. The knight must be captured, e4, and now rook b to d1 check. And unless he pointlessly interposes a piece, the only way to get out of check is to play this move, king to c5. Firouzja continues, b4. Now he's got Aronian's king on the run in the middle of the board. Can you imagine a super grandmaster ending up with their king in this position, the black king on c4 with queens and all these pieces on the board? Dangerous. So queen to h6 threatens the e6 pawn with check, also hits the bishop at h5. It could return to c1 as part of the attack later. Knight takes b4, which defends the pawn at e6, counterattacks the bishop at c2, but Firouzja goes ahead and takes the bishop at h5. Now bishop takes c3, knight takes bishop, and knight takes c2. Rook e4 check. Now, after rook e4 check, king takes c3, so now for a moment Aronian is actually up a minor piece, but now rook takes rook. So Firouzja is up an exchange, which with a much safer king. There is no back rank mate, by the way. A queen to b1 check, you just return the rook to d1, and it's defended by the queen here at h5. So there is no back rank mate. So instead, Aronian plays king to b2. The queen goes to e5 with check, and after king a3, rook to d3 check, Aronian resigned, as mate is inevitable. I'll give you one variation. King to a2, rook to a4 check, if knight to a3, rook a3 check, king b1, rook a1 check. Again, the rook defended by the queen. And after king c2, queen to e2 is mate. And that would have been the final position, most likely, had Aronian not resigned. So again, we see Firouzja really playing brilliant chess in this NIC Classic tournament on Chess 24. And just very, very impressive stuff. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something about the London system. I know I sure did. Thank you for joining us. Join us again soon. Bye.